Coming up on Arirang News, the Korea Development Institute, a think tank, slashes its economic growth forecast for South Korea to just 0.2%. Because of the coronavirus pandemic, that'll be the lowest growth since 1998. The Finance Ministry announces a package of financial aid worth $33 billion to help large companies keep their workers employed. Firms that take the money will have to keep at least 90% of their workers on the books for 6 months. And South Korea's high school seniors start going back to class. The government says it's being extremely vigilant. Some schools, however, have had to close back up due to a few new infections in their neighborhoods. It's 5 p.m. here in Seoul. Thanks for joining us on Arirang News. I'm Devin Whiting. With high school seniors returning to the classroom today, Prime Minister Chung Se-kyun is stressing the need to ensure they are safe from COVID-19. There are still risks, he says. Here's the Prime Minister this morning.
Reopening schools is the last stage of distancing in daily life. We need to work together to ensure absolute safety in schools when they proceed with classes.
He said the spread of infections linked to nightclubs in Itaewon has not ended, and risks remain because the root cause of cluster infections in hospitals is still unknown. He stressed the need to thoroughly manage those risks while ensuring the students' right to education. Chung also called on the health authorities to stop teenagers from going to singing rooms, which have been recent sites of infections. He added that local government officials, the Ministry of Education, local offices of education, and school faculty members have done their best to prepare for reopening and are ready to respond to any unexpected situation. Countries that took part in the WHO's annual assembly on Tuesday have agreed on the need for transparent and fair access to COVID-19 vaccines and treatments. They also endorsed a resolution tabled by the EU to start an independent probe into the WHO's response to the pandemic. Kim Hyo-sun reports.
The 194 member states of the World Health Organization are calling for the need for transparent, equitable, and timely access to any treatments or vaccines developed against COVID-19. During the World Health Assembly meeting on Tuesday held virtually, its members also agreed to launch an independent probe into the WHO's handling of the pandemic. The agreement came as the European Union initiated a resolution calling for a comprehensive, impartial, and independent assessment of the agency's response. It was endorsed by nearly 100 member states. Welcoming the resolution, the WHO chief highlighted the principles of transparency and accountability.
As always, WHO remains fully committed to transparency, accountability, and continuous improvement. We want accountability more than anyone.
The resolution was supported by China and the U.S., who have been at odds over the WHO following the Trump administration's threats to withdraw from the agency. On the day of the meeting, President Trump threatened to permanently halt funding for the WHO if it does not commit to improvements within 30 days. Washington, however, was criticized by the EU for weakening multilateral cooperation and coordination in the face of a global crisis. On the sidelines, the issue of enabling Taiwan to attend the conference was also a hot topic. In the run-up to the meeting, calls for Taiwan to be allowed to join, led mainly by the U.S., threatened to anger Beijing, which has blocked Taiwan from attending since 2016 under its One China policy. Kim Hyo-sun, Arirang News.
The coronavirus pandemic could push down South Korea's economic growth rate for this year to almost zero. That's according to a state-run economic think tank, which published its forecast for the Korean economy on Wednesday. Ji-young has more.
The Korea Development Institute has significantly slashed its growth forecast for the Korean economy this year to almost zero. In its report published on Wednesday, it forecasts just 0.2% growth this year. That's 2.1% lower than its forecast in November last year before the coronavirus outbreak.
The cut in economic growth forecast is mainly due to weak consumer spending and a contraction in exports amid the global pandemic.
The think tank forecasts private consumption to drop by 2% this year. It said the damage in consumption in the service sector, which requires face-to-face interaction, is expected to be especially severe. The country's exports are forecast to fall by 15.9% as many countries worldwide have taken lockdown measures amid the spread of the coronavirus. If the projections are correct, it'll be the country's lowest rate of growth since the 1998 foreign exchange crisis, when Korea saw the economy shrink by 5.1%. One overseas expert said the actual growth rate will depend on what other countries do to deal with the pandemic.
We find the Korean economy, which would have grown at 2.4% in 2020 without the virus, it loses 4% growth, so it grows at minus 1.6. Now that's on the assumption that all countries do the right thing.
An official at the KDI said if the spread of COVID-19 slows down, a growth rate of 1.1% can be expected, but if the pandemic lasts for longer, it could result in the economy shrinking by 1.6%. 엄지영, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, the South Korean government is continuing to roll out enormous financial aid packages to support the local industries hit hardest by the pandemic. The latest round is specifically for large companies so they don't have to lay off their employees. Kim Da-mi reports.
South Korea's finance ministry has pledged around $33 billion over the coming month to help local large-sized firms to stay afloat during the COVID-19 pandemic.
The eligible firms include those in the aviation and marine transport sectors. The threshold is having more than 300 employees and at least $408 million of debt.
Companies that received the support need to keep more than 90% of their employees for at least 6 months after receiving the funds. They're also prohibited from using the money to buy their own dividends or stocks. Finance Minister Hong Nam-gi is also vowing to swiftly secure an almost $2.9 billion supplementary budget for job creation efforts in the public sector. Hong said the funds will be used to create more than 550,000 new jobs, including some 100,000 new jobs in non-contact and digital sectors. To stabilize the corporate bond markets, the government and the central bank will set up a special purpose vehicle to buy commercial papers from companies with low credit ratings. The roughly $8 billion vehicle will run for 6 months and can be doubled depending on the market situation. The finance ministry will announce detailed plans to boost consumption and investment, as well as South Korea's own version of the New Deal in early June, when it lays out its economic policy direction for the second half of 2020. Kim Da-mi, Arirang News.
Time now for an in-depth look at the market news this afternoon, and for that I'm joined on the line by Dr. Yang Jun-seok, Professor of Economics at the Catholic University of Korea. Professor Yang, thank you as always for coming on.
Happy to be here.
In the U.S., both Jerome Powell, Fed Chairman, and Steve Mnuchin, Treasury Secretary, are under pressure to do more to prevent an even worse economic downturn. They're taking different approaches to the problem, it seems, according to what they said yesterday. What do you make of this situation, and what else should be done to save the American economy?
Okay, well, the Fed Chairman Powell has been saying something that's a lot different from what the Trump administration is advocating, but when both of them testified at the Congress at the same time on Monday, Chairman Powell seems to be being very careful in what he said so that he doesn't contradict the statements from President Trump and his administration too much. But basically, Fed Chairman Powell is advocating a lot more active fiscal policy by Congress, and he's also warning that this recession, because of the COVID virus, will last probably a long time. It'll probably last until at least the end of next year. So they're in for the long haul, but they can make the problem a lot less if Congress takes a more active approach, provides more funding to regional governments, state governments, and have a more keep on funding the unemployment insurance for the people who are lost their jobs by the coronavirus. But the Trump administration seems to be saying something that is different, which is that they should stop active funding to the state governments or reduce it. They should reduce the unemployment insurance, and things should go back to normal as quickly as possible. Mnuchin emphasized that the longer the economy is in a lockdown, the more difficult the economy will be to revive. So they are actively trying to get back to normal, even though a lot of epidemiologists are saying that this is too early. One thing that concerns me a lot is that the Republicans in U.S. Congress seem to be considering a waiver on liability for employers if their employees catch the coronavirus while working. And I think that's going to be very, very controversial. So the Fed and the Treasury, the Trump administration is coming at this from very different angles. But I think the Fed Chairman Powell is trying to do everything he can not to create too much friction between the Fed and the executive branch.
Well, partly because of those issues, stocks were down on Wall Street overnight, the Dow by about 1.5% and the NASDAQ by 0.5%. What's the story in the global markets?
Okay, well, that apparently was because of the announcement by Moderna medical suppliers, medical research firm yesterday, saying that they had very good results from their vaccine research, but it turned out that today, or more accurately, very early this morning, Korea time, a lot of people questioned that research. It seems that only part of that research was revealed, and the research result was not good enough to satisfy a lot of specialists and scientists. So that created a lower market for the United States yesterday, their time. Now the problem seems to be that the market is fluctuating too much. The news from the Fed Chairman Powell also seemed to have played negatively into the market because he said that the coronavirus recession may last longer than what people expect. So I think the market is still reacting very sensitively to the news, though it surprises me a little bit because this is not new news. It's actually old news. It should have been baked into the market, but every time someone comes up with a slightly optimistic statement or a slightly pessimistic statement, the market, at least in the United States, seems to be overreacting. So the United States market is still very, very sensitive to any kind of news that is being announced.
Well, now we saw yesterday that earnings by Korea's listed companies were cut in half in the first quarter. It seems that'll get even worse in Q2 when exports have taken a bigger hit. What's your outlook for the Korean financial markets?
Okay, well, an interesting thing I think happened today. Even though as you mentioned, the earnings report is not very good, KOSPI actually rose today, and I really expected the KOSPI to drop today because of the bad news in the United States. And when we look at how the KOSPI market rose today, it seems that the individual buyers who are responsible for keeping KOSPI relatively on a higher level, on a level of recovery, they actually sold more stocks, whereas foreigners who have been abandoning Korean stocks have now bought Korean stocks, and they were responsible for the market rise in KOSPI today. So one interesting possibility may be that they're looking at Korea as an alternative to U.S. market. When the U.S. market did badly yesterday, some of that money flowed into Korea. Now, if the U.S. investors are thinking about Korean market as an alternative to the U.S. market, then that means whenever U.S. market faces bad news, maybe it'll be good news for Korea, but we'll have to wait and see whether that pattern holds for KOSPI. KOSDAQ, on the other hand, they've been having, I think, an incredible couple of weeks. They're now recovered beyond the levels of pre-coronavirus. They reached a level of what was the KOSDAQ has reached the levels that they had last summer. They've gone beyond the pre-corona level, February levels, and they may actually hit year high in just a few weeks. I'm amazed at how well KOSDAQ is doing. it's outpacing the NASDAQ market by quite a bit.
Quite a rally indeed. All right, Professor Young, we appreciate your insights. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you.
Now, with the coronavirus curve appearing to flatten in a number of countries, South Korea's airlines are gradually restoring their international services. Chae Won-jong has the details.
Empty seats throughout the terminal, fewer people waiting to check in for flights. As the COVID-19 pandemic continues to grip the world, many airlines around the world have all but halted their international services in recent months. South Korea's flagship carrier Korean Air is gradually reopening international routes that have been suspended as a result of the pandemic. However, given the circumstances, new guidelines will be in place.
From May 18th, all domestic passengers are required to wear face masks, and passengers must scan their own boarding pass before boarding. We are doing everything we can to prevent the spread of COVID-19.
Since the virus emerged, Korean Air has allocated seats based on the number of reservations to keep social distancing between passengers.
This isn't that hard because we've been wearing face masks for so long anyway. But I'm worried that it will become uncomfortable to wear masks when it gets warmer, so I hope COVID-19 is eradicated soon.
The airline's flight attendants also wear goggles and protective gowns while serving passengers during flights. An official from Korean Air says the airline will open 32 of its 110 international routes starting in June. Chae Won-jong, Arirang News.
And that does it for this newscast. Thank you for watching.